Hey there, and welcome back to day 2 of Gratitude Week here at the Spark Creativity Teacher Podcast. I'm so glad you're joining me as we revisit some wonderful interviews from the archive. We're about to turn our attention to an interview with Dr. Sarah Fine, one of my best friends in graduate school and a scholar whose work around deeper learning I'm so grateful to be able to share with you. Let's do this. Welcome to the Spark Creativity Teacher Podcast, a podcast for English teachers in search of creative teaching strategies. I'm Betsy Potash, and I'm glad to welcome you to episode 86. Today, I'm talking to Sarah Fine, co-author of the book In Search of Deeper Learning. As you'll hear, she and her research partner, Jal Mehta, crisscrossed the country looking for schools and classrooms where learning was happening on the deepest levels, then documented their findings in a book I wish I could give every teacher in the country a pro-grow day to read. In this interview, you're going to hear about the surprising places they discovered the deepest learning happening and how we can all begin to take action to build more opportunities for deeper learning into our schools. Let me tell you a little bit about Sarah. As her friend and one-time grad school roommate back when we both attended the Breadloaf School of English together, I can tell you she plays a fierce game of Scrabble and co-hosts a great class picnic. I can tell you that her years as a teacher and department chair in a struggling inner-city school in Washington, D.C. filled her with questions about our education system and passion for changing the way school works in our country. I've watched her beautiful children begin to grow up via coast-to-coast holiday cards and applauded from afar as she has moved to the forefront of progressive education in America. When I read the book she wrote with Jal Mehta, I knew I wanted to do everything I could to get it into the hands of as many teachers as possible. Because really, what could be more important than talking about what leads to deeper learning in our classrooms? The book is full of vivid examples of powerful learning and actionable ideas you can start to work into your planning immediately. In fact, in the show notes today, I'm going to include an action guide for you with a checklist of options you can use to help move your curriculum into spaces of even deeper learning. I imagine that as a teacher who I know already values creativity, you're going to be nodding along and smiling with everything Sarah says today, just like me. The margins of my book are filled with stars and exclamation points, as well as lots and lots of bold, colorful underlining. But enough of my enthusiastic introduction. Let's jump in. Well, welcome to the show, Sarah Fine. I'm so glad you're here.
I'm really excited to be here and talk.
Yay. Can you tell us a little about yourself and how you came to write this amazing book with Jal, In Search of Deeper Learning?
Sure. Well, you know part of the story, but I can start from the beginning. I started my career right after college as a teacher. So I worked for 4 years in an urban high school in DC, and teaching English, and then at some point doing some instructional coaching. And it was right at the moment, so it was in sort of the early 2000s, right when the No Child Left Behind era was kind of getting into full swing. And working in a Title I school meant that I really felt the effects of that. We all did. So testing really sort of reigned supreme for all of us, not by choice really, but because our school was in danger of getting shut down or put into state receivership. So the reason I left the classroom was not that I didn't enjoy and love my students or the learning I was doing as a teacher, but really because it just felt like something had gone wrong around the incentives and goals we were setting for ourselves. And there really didn't at that time feel like there was an easy way to change course. And I really felt pretty uncomfortable with some of what I was being asked to do around test prep and sort of like in a very focused way, thinking about kids at the time who were quote unquote on the bubble, meaning we needed to get them sort of from not passing to passing. And a lot of the goals that had drawn me to teaching felt like they got kind of obscured. So I ran away to grad school and thinking that maybe I would have the chance to sort of see the landscape more fully and understand some of what I'd been experiencing with some different lenses. And that's where I met Jal Mehta, who became my co-author. At the time, he was a new junior professor at Harvard Grad School of Ed. And when we met, we actually pretty quickly realized we were feeling a lot of the same things from our different vantage points, namely that something about sort of the era of accountability and testing had, on the one hand, maybe done some good things in terms of making people focus on kids who were being least well served by the system. But on the other hand, had really kind of narrowed the conversation about what schools could be at their best and what are goals worth pursuing with kids in a truly aspirational way. And so the way we write about it in our book is that we sort of felt like there was increasing focus on sort of the floor of learning, like making sure everybody receives sort of at minimum some basic foundational skills around literacy and numeracy. And while we, agreed that that's a worthy goal, we felt like conversations about the ceiling, about kind of what do we really want for our kids beyond those things, were being sort of shut down. And so we hatched this plan, which was really idealistic and not very realistic. we were like, well, we're just going to go find some schools that are sort of doing this work that's more about ceilings and not just floors. So, and then we're going to go find them. We're going to write about them. We'll write up some case studies and we'll put them out there, and maybe it will help to galvanize a conversation that includes kind of schools at their best and not just what do we do when kids are not meeting basic thresholds. And so that was kind of all we had at that moment. And so we started asking around. We didn't have any money. We didn't really know where we were going with it. We asked around. We sort of gave some criteria to people we knew in the field, policymakers, educators, professors, and we asked, where should we go? And we got some names of places back. And so we scrapped together a tiny little grant that allowed us to start visiting schools. And the problem, as we write about in the book, is that so we spent the first year really puzzled and disappointed because we would fly to these schools that had, these incredible reputations for doing innovative, original, sort of disruptive work. And on the one hand, we did see some really amazing stuff at those schools, which we can talk about later if you want. But on the other hand, we also saw a lot of really traditional, not particularly inspired work happening at those schools. And we saw a lot of classes where kids were pretty disengaged from what they were learning, where what they were learning was more or less what, you might see at many schools across the U.S. You're memorizing periodic table and you're sort of racing through Hamlet and so on. And so we were puzzled by that pattern and obviously quite disappointed that these places didn't have all the answers the way we had hoped they would. So that shifted our study quite a bit. And so we actually ended up spending 6 years studying schools rather than 1 or 2. We ended up at 30 different schools across the country rather than 3 or 4 the way we originally planned. So it sort of blew up in our face a little bit. But it ended up being in some ways, a study about what the constraints are and what the traditions are that make it so difficult, even in a very innovative school with commitments to doing things differently, to have consistently deep instruction. So I'll stop there and then we can figure out what you want to talk about.
Okay, so let's start in the big picture of this amazing book, In Search of Deeper Learning. If you were going to kind of boil it down to one a manifesto for deeper learning, what would that be?
That's a big question.
Yeah, it is.
It's a big book, and it's a big question.
It's an
How do you boil
book.
400 pages into a sentence or two? Well, let me give it a try. So I think one of the things that we emerged feeling very strongly is that learners in K-12 schools, and in particular adolescents, because we focused on high schools mainly, are incredibly curious and capable and creative. They have, under the right conditions, they are eager and interested and engaging in authentic, rich learning. They have a huge amount of capacity in terms of what they can do when they see reason to engage. And we really think that our schools, as we have set them up historically and through to the present, especially public schools, but I think there are traditions that extend beyond the public domain, are not set up to capitalize on those capacities. And that there's something profoundly misaligned between the way that we as a society have thought about schooling and structured schooling and what powerful learning actually requires and looks like at its best. and that our schools are bounded by all of these constraints and parameters and sort of historical traditions and mindsets, all of which really make it difficult to achieve powerful learning inside of classrooms. And yet there are a lot of examples that we wrote about and that we can talk about of teachers and spaces inside of our schools where really exciting, very different kinds of experiences are happening for kids. And so I guess the bad news is that there is a kind of mismatch between the institutions and the goals that we at least would like to see kids reaching. And the good news is that, in fact, despite all of those traditions and constraints, there are places in all of the schools that we saw, regardless of whether they were sort of quote unquote innovative, high profile schools or not, where kids were really learning in powerful ways and experiencing authentic work and growth. And so, the question might be, how do we expand those places so that they become more of the rule and less of the exception?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my end feeling when I finished the book was extremely hopeful. I mean, you found so much and you were able to translate it out in ways that teachers could immediately start to take action. So let's start to dive into some of those, the inspiring areas, the places where,
Sure.
The grammar of schooling has been adapted or has been used effectively for creative deep learning. And I feel like a good place to start is the periphery. You talk a lot about the periphery, the extracurriculars, the clubs, the electives. What kind of learning is happening there, and how can we bring the gold from the periphery into the classroom?
Yeah, that's a huge part of our book, and to be really honest, that was one of the most unexpected findings that we stumbled into, and then became really interested in once we started noticing it. So the context is that originally we sort of just by default assumed that what we were looking for would be, most prevalent in core academic classes. We wanted to see examples where kids, for example, said that the time flew by when they were in those spaces, that they would carry the conversations that they'd had in those spaces out into the hallways and home with them, indicators of deep engagement and interest. And instead, what we would notice is that when we would ask the students we spent time with, we would sort of describe those conditions, like where are you doing work that you're proud of? Where is the space in the school or the time of day when you're doing stuff that you sort of feel compelled to talk about beyond that space? They would be telling us things at the periphery, like you said. So they would say, oh, well, that's school newspaper, or that's my green engineering elective, or that's the play that the theater production I'm in after school. And so at some point we realized we had to turn our attention to those spaces. So anyway, we ended up turning our attention to those places and really immersing ourselves in some of them. So we spent a long time following a student theater production all the way from inception to the performance. We followed a debate team. We spent a lot of time in a number of elective courses, the arts, etc. And I think what we realized, it's not that every single one of those spaces is a place of deep, powerful, authentic learning for kids, but we saw a lot more of it than we saw with consistency in academic courses. And so the questions we started asking were sort of, what are the conditions here, and what is it that is enabling this work to happen more consistently here? And we had a number of things that we came to. One of them obviously has to do with choice, right? And that's the biggest thing we hear from teachers when they read this part of our book, is that it's all well and good to mount an argument that electives are, more powerfully aligned to deep learning than other courses. But what about the fact that kids have chosen to be there? And we could circle back to how teachers in core courses can create more choice within. But I think more importantly, first of all, there is often an authentic product or production being mounted that all kids in this space are involved in creating. And so they are actually making something, right? You are going to put out a new edition of a newspaper or an original version of a play or a piece of art. And so there's a piece around creativity, literally, like that you are making something that did not exist before. Right. Whereas you think about a traditional high school math class, the sort of final assessment, the end product of what you're doing, is often a unit test that has literally been reused for 10 years. I mean, there's there's something profoundly unoriginal there, and I don't think it's particularly compelling to kids to have to do something like that, where they really have no agency over the form of what comes of their learning. So I think there's that. And then another really big piece has to do with the community of practice that gets created in those spaces. For example, when we followed the theater production, kids would often refer to themselves as the theater kids. Like
Yes.
that's who we are, right? There's like a deep part of their identity. It's not, I am somebody who happens to be doing this production after school. It's like, this is part of how I see myself now. And it's part of how I identify who my people are in this space, especially in a large high school. Same thing with newspaper and so on. And so I think there's a piece around the sort of collegial relationships that come when you're working together in an intensive way towards something that you have to create together. And that's the third piece, is that more often than not in those spaces, what is being produced requires sort of interrelated roles and mutually supportive roles, right? So in a theater production, not every kid is doing the same thing at the same time, right? There's not the same element of lockstep learning that there is in a lot of academic courses. You know, the kid who is an incredible artist is working on the set, and the kid who is becoming skillful with lighting is working on the lights. And, you know, the actors are obviously working on their individualized parts. But all of those components are essential to making the production high quality, right? If you don't have the lights, in sync with the decisions that the director and the actors are making, then it all falls apart. And so the idea of sort of interrelated roles where kids actually need each other in fairly organic, authentic ways, where there's room for kids to be good at some things and not as good at other things. And that's okay, because that's actually what you need when you're working on a complex production of some kind. I think, number one, that matches on to the way that work happens in the real world, much more so than everybody doing the same thing at the same time. And then two, I think it just creates this sense of collectivism, like we need each other. If so-and-so is absent, we have this great quote from this Spanish teacher who also happened to be involved in the theater production we watched. And he basically said, and I'm paraphrasing, look, if like Billy's gone from my second period Spanish class, like it doesn't really matter, like the Spanish class goes on essentially as I had planned it, regardless of who exactly is there and who's not. But if Billy is gone from, our rehearsal 2 days before the performance and Billy's in charge of the lights, like it's all sunk, like we actually really need each other in that space. And I think the kids really feel that. There's a sense of value in working together that doesn't often happen in academic classes. So I think for all those reasons, there's a sense that those spaces just have a kind of a grammar, to use your word, and a way of organizing the work and the learning that is more aligned to 21st century life, to the professions, to the kinds of problems that skilled professionals work on, and also just is more compelling to kids because they have more agency and sort of ownership, and there's more uncertainty in terms of what they're working toward and their role in it than there often is in academic courses.
Yeah. Wow. I love it. I love it all. How could a teacher begin to experiment with setting up a core academic class to look more like the periphery?
Yeah, and that's the zillion-dollar question, right? And I work my career, my day job is supporting pre-service teachers, all of whom actually are going into core academic areas. So I think about this a lot. I think the first important thing is to think about the notion. This is a colleague of ours at Harvard, Dave Perkins, who long ago came up with this idea of playing the whole game at the junior level. And what he means by that is, if you think about a baseball, like a, little league baseball team, the way kids learn to play baseball is by playing the game of baseball and playing it badly, right? They're, if you've ever seen like a kid's soccer team, it's like a bunch of children running after a ball. But they are in fact doing a very junior in that case, level version of what baseball looks like in the professional world.
Yeah.
Right. At its best, the game of baseball has more or less the same set of rules and routines and use of time and all of that it would in Little League. And so the kids from the very beginning have a sense of sort of the whole game, what it is, how the parts fit together. And then the reason why they then might, as they get more involved or more skillful, spend lots of time practicing the parts, for example, batting practice or doing running drills or whatever. The reason that they would dig in and dive deep into building their skills in those individual parts is kind of framed by the fact that they know that those parts are part of the whole game, and that practicing hitting over and over and over again will make them better when they come to actually be at bat in the real game. And then all through, right? You don't spend 5 years, doing drills before you get to play the game again. It's like there's a back and forth continuously between skill building and sort of going deep on one element of the game and actually playing the game. And the comparison there is like, if you think about what often happens in high school courses, and I have been a culprit of this absolutely as a former high school English teacher, is number one, the kids don't know what the whole game is, right? Like think about kids in a high school science class, for example. How many of them have a sense of what science actually looks like in the professional world and what it would mean, for example, to be a bench chemist or a biologist? There's often very little connection to the work as it exists in a professional domain. So the first thing is they don't really know what the whole game is. And some teachers may know what the whole game looks and feels like and have themselves participated, but often they don't. Often they themselves come right out of college, get a teaching degree, go straight into teaching, and they haven't actually really worked in a lab. And so they don't really have a sense of what science is like in the professional world outside of K-12 or college. And that's not their fault. We can talk about how there's all kinds of ways that, the whole system sets teachers up to kind of play the game in a way that isn't conducive to deep learning. But then, so they don't know what the whole game is. There's that. And then there's the piece around, we just endlessly practice the parts with them, right? So like myself, I just remember, like, we're going to find the main idea again and again and again and again, or we are going to like work on our topic sentences again and again and again. Now, is it useful to do skill practice like that? I would argue to a certain point, absolutely. But to do it in a decontextualized way where kids don't really have a sense of what they're working toward, or how the parts could fit together towards some end that is authentic and interesting to them, I think that's, I can't blame them for being disengaged from that. And then I think we also have this incredibly individualistic way of structuring the student experience in academic classes, right? So like I said before, it's every kid for themselves, and we might let them do group work at a given moment. But really, when it comes to the quote unquote performance they might be doing to demonstrate their learning at the end of the unit or the term, it's almost always every kid doing the same thing independently and us judging their work independently. And so I think there's something inherently problematic about that, where kids aren't actually authentically needing to learn from and with each other, and where they're being judged on their own rather than building something together, creating something that requires differentiated roles and interdependence. I think there's just a loss there based on the structure of how we set things up.
Yeah. That leads me kind of nicely into my next question, which was going to be about authentic purpose and apprenticeship. So if we're trying to get the students to work with each other, to have some sort of larger context within academia, like can you give some examples of classrooms you saw where that authentic purpose and that community interdependence was really happening and the deeper learning was really happening?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a bunch of examples in the book, but the one I want to talk about is actually my own son's kindergarten class from last year. He goes to a project-based school, and the kids are learning to read and write and all the things you would hope in kindergarten. But the notion of a project that has an authentic audience and purpose and that requires kids to work together is still very alive. And so last year, as their first big project for the first half of the year, the two kindergarten teachers at the school had noticed that there was a big portion of the play area behind the school that was not being used very well. Just there wasn't anything there really, and kids wouldn't spend much time up there. So they effectively decided that their kindergarten classes would spend the half of the year designing something that would make that space a play space, like an authentic play space for kids. And so as part of that, the kids went and experienced a whole bunch of different play spaces around San Diego where we live. So they went to a nature play area and they would play there, but then they would also record in simple ways, obviously, their experiences there. What did they enjoy playing with? They did some surveying of kids in the school, like what do you like to play with and why? They did some mapping of where the sun was at different points of the day so they could think about if they were going to build a structure in that area, where would be the good place to put it. So there was a lot of sort of math and numeracy content woven in there. And then they came up with, so in groups, they came up with designs and ideas for things that they thought they could build in that space. And they had to figure out a way to combine their ideas. So there's a lot of negotiation and collaboration there to sort of choose some of the, so it wasn't like one kid's idea was going to be the idea. The question was like, okay, if one group has come up with a prototype and another group has come up with a totally different idea, how can we combine those together? They went through rounds of critique with various people in the school and outside the school, parents, kids, our administrators. And eventually, as a class, they had a design for how to use part of the space, and the other class did the other part, which involved like there was a playhouse with a play kitchen that they built. There's like a interactive music wall where they used some organic materials to do music. There was a water play area, which was a little controversial, but the kids were really excited about. So anyway, so you can, and then they actually built the stuff, right, with some support from parents and their teachers. But they, they actually did some actual construction. They helped to gather the materials. They thought about what kinds of materials would weather well over time. So the idea is they were working on something that, first of all, had authentic use value to a community that they knew, right, their own school community in this case, that they themselves wanted to play at, like even, to this day, the students are constantly talking about going upstairs, which is what they call that area, and play. They still play up there. There was lots of content snuck in there because the teachers very skillfully made sure there was opportunities to connect to literacy and math and so on, and sort of social emotional learning. But the kids, none of this would have materialized if every kid had done this project independently and like come up with the drawing for what they wanted to be the play area. It was much more of a collective endeavor. It had something that kids could sort of proudly showcase at the end of the unit, and that they themselves then joyfully engaged with. And so the use value was really evident to them. They were incredibly proud of the work that they did. So I think, and I do want to say, like, they were still doing readers workshop every day, and they were still, they still had their math hour every day, and it wasn't they weren't engaging in this project to the detriment of building other foundational skills that didn't quite fit in with the project itself. So, there's a balance between practicing the parts and working on something that's really cool and exciting. But, I do think that that's a really nice example of how kids can work towards something that feels powerful and important and authentic to them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's an amazing example. Do you feel like the providing of context and the providing of the sort of sense that you're playing the whole game at the junior level is almost always in line with project-based learning?
I think that project-based learning is a fairly promising platform for achieving some of the qualities that we think of when we think about authentic, powerful, deep learning. Because I think that projects tend to be more interdisciplinary. For example, they tend to be focused on some kind of performance or some kind of artifact to be created. There's a lot of attention to audience in a way that I often see folks neglecting when they're not living inside of sort of project-based learning world. So I do think there's some components that are very well aligned. I also want to say I have seen project-based learning done poorly and it's disastrous. And it's,
Sure.
it's all the things that people have criticized progressive education for over the years. There's not enough rich thinking. There's not enough sort of discipline and rigor in terms of the learning.
Yeah.
If you don't truly have an authentic audience, but you're like kind of have one, that's a very different situation than having sort of a quote unquote client or audience where you're really doing something that feels like the use value is genuine. So, I also think that it's project-based learning, like a lot of pedagogies, is a container inside of which there's a lot of discretion to either capitalize on the assets it has or to not do that. And conversely, I've seen some classrooms that are not project-based that have incredible richness to them. So I don't want to suggest that PBL is the only way to achieve deep learning. I do, I work in a project-based school environment. I send my kids to project-based schools. There's reasons why I think it's, it has some advantages.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, you really looked at a lot of different containers for learning. The initial sections of the book are looking at the IB, looking at project-based learning, looking at a sort of more conventional large high school with AP classes, and it seemed, as I was reading, I mean, I read through the no excuses schools, the IB schools, all the different schools, and you found things to love everywhere and things that were problematic. But where I was most excited to be reading was about the periphery, about the whole game at the junior level, and then the chapter about the most effective teachers you saw. And that's what I want to ask you about now. You guys carefully studied these teachers whose classrooms you were in and studied what made them effective and what were the fundamental qualities of the most effective teachers. And this is such a fascinating subject. So can you share a little bit about what you felt made teachers most effective in the search for deeper learning?
Yeah, absolutely. And in that case of that chapter, we wanted to really, to your point, steer away from seeing teachers that were working in very specialized environments and really zero in on teachers that were teaching in fairly conventional schools and teaching core subjects and still managing to achieve some of those qualities. So we wrote them up as a series of cases, and we were very sad because there were plenty more teachers we had seen that fit into that box than we were able to write about. Yeah. So that's on the sort of hopeful news front, is these, yeah, or more sort of, if you want to go looking for deeper learning and you're an educator, don't feel like you have to, fly across the country to some school that's received all these accolades. It's likely that in your own context, there are some people who are making some real headway. So I can describe one teacher in particular who taught a set of science classes at a large urban non-selective high school, a very traditional school by a lot of standards, working with kids who are fairly high poverty and high needs. And she herself had been a bench chemist for several years. She had studied chemistry in college, gone on to actually do chemistry in and out of the lab, and then eventually found her way to teaching. And that's important for reasons I'll describe in a few minutes. But we spent a lot of time observing her course called Methods of Scientific Inquiry, which was effectively a required course for, I believe, 10th grade students that took the place of physical science or something like that. But basically, she really, really strongly felt that the way that science is often taught to high schoolers is really misaligned to the quote unquote whole game of science as she had lived and experienced it in her job. In particular, that when we teach the scientific method, kids often, and I speak for myself too, in my suburban, fairly affluent public school, this was how I learned science too. They see the scientific method as a series of 5 steps that are fairly cut and dry, and they're linear, and you move from one to the next pretty quickly. And that actually, as she had experienced it, the scientific method, the way that you inquire into questions in science, is really not that at all. So that number one, the level of uncertainty that often accompanies scientific inquiry is very, very high, because scientists are not spending time proving to themselves things that are already known. They're investigating the unknown, right? Like nobody's getting paid to prove to themselves that gravity is a thing, or that 2 compounds will react in a certain way if that's already known. And what often happens in our high school science classes, chemistry in particular, is that when students do any kind of hands-on work at all, like they might have a lab block once a week, usually what they're doing in that lab is just effectively proving to themselves something that they already know the answer to. So they're doing a quote unquote experiment, except that the outcome is already known. And so it's really just kind of going through the steps of demonstrating that, in fact, these compounds will create this thing. There's very little uncertainty.
Yeah.
And so she created this course where over I believe 6 months, kids in groups went through a much more whole game at the junior level version of science. And so they learned some chemistry along the way. It wasn't that this course was completely devoid of any kind of direct instruction, but the through line of the course was this process where kids would decide on a question that was of genuine interest to them that they could explore scientifically. And you can imagine for these students who didn't have a lot of science background, some of the questions were fairly simple, like, what's the best way to remove a Coke stain from your pants? Or, does listening to music actually increase your productivity, or does it make it worse? Those kinds of questions. But the important thing in her mind, and she explained this to us, is that they did not know the answers. And in fact, she didn't necessarily know the answers. And so there's an element of genuine uncertainty and curiosity that gets activated there. And so the kids would then do a literature review. They would go to the scientific research to try to understand what that is already known can help us predict or come up with some thinking to test in this case. And so she taught them how to navigate scientific journals. In some cases, it involved learning some science content that they didn't already know. And then they had to design an experimental design experiment, which is, it sounds simple, but it really isn't, because when you're actually trying to test something and you don't already have your teacher having brought in pre-measured versions of the materials you need, there's a lot of questions about feasibility, about financial constraints, about logistical constraints. Can we actually come up with a sample size that is unbiased, that is big enough to have statistical power, et cetera? And so, again, kids were experiencing the scientific method there in a way that's much truer to what happens in the world of real science, where there's lots of constraints and there's lots of politics and there's all kinds of questions about feasibility all the time. And then they would carry out their experiments, and in many cases, they would get null results, which is also what happens in the real world in science, right? Like more times than not, your hypothesis is not proven, or the experiment somehow goes wrong, or your measurement turns out to have been off, and you can't replicate it. So again, all of these parts of the scientific process were getting like exploded into something much more interesting and much more aligned to sort of what real science is like. Eventually, the kids would write up their findings, and there's a big science fair, district-wide science fair, that they would be part of and compete for slots in the sort of finalist areas. And she actually herself, this teacher, said she was searching for other venues for these students to exhibit their work in, because, a science fair is a little bit authentic. It's better than turning a paper into a teacher and getting a grade back, but it's not quite as authentic an audience as presenting, for example, to practicing scientists. And so what was really exciting to us was that, the kids were learning science, but they were learning things about the domain of science in ways that really mirrored science as it is experienced in the world beyond school, number one. They had real agency, and there was real uncertainty attached to the work that they were doing. The teacher's role was to help them navigate to the knowledge and resources they would need in order to do things correctly. But she was not positioning herself as sort of like the intermediary between a bunch of fixed knowledge and the students, as a lot of us often default to, because that's sort of deeply ingrained in us as what it means to be a teacher. It's like, okay, there's this stuff that the world has figured out, and my job is to somehow get that stuff into my students' heads. So she had really figured out a way to kind of sidestep that. And while she was more of an expert than they were, and she did use that to help them in a lot of cases, it was much more student-driven and student-led than I have ever seen a science class in that kind of context be before.
Would she sort of teach them and be working on these projects with them throughout an entire year? Or was this just like 1 month of the course? Or
It was a half of a year. So I think in her case, students were on some kind of, 2-semester schedule. Yeah. So it was basically one term. And like I said, they were also learning some chemistry along the way. They were learning things, they were in fact learning the periodic table and learning how to balance equations and some more traditional science chemistry content. But I think this line of inquiry really helped them both see the use value of those things and also sort of experience experimentation in much truer form than a lot of kids ever get exposed to in high school.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So let's say a teacher listening is feeling really fired up right now to go and start to create change at his or her school. How do you recommend that teachers begin to help their schools break down these sort of old these ideas of the teacher as the translator of knowledge into the students' heads, the way that schooling has been done for so long? If teachers want to try this new grammar of learning, how can they put it into place? What are some initial steps?
That is also $1 million question. We get asked that a lot, and I don't claim to have all the answers.
Of course.
I think there's two things that can be really sort of high leverage ways to start transitioning. One is around exhibiting learning to a more authentic audience than might happen otherwise. So I really think that even if you're not working in a project-based school, and even if there's not a huge amount of support yet at your school for sort of changing the way that you do things, I think that there are fairly easy ways to do more than just have kids turn in an end of unit paper or test that can really help them feel like what they're working toward has some value beyond sort of the closed circuit situation of your classroom. And so I can use myself as an example. I don't think I ever really achieved particularly powerful learning early in my career for a number of reasons. But in the fourth year I was working at the charter school where I was, my colleague and I were doing a project on poetry, and we were teaching in some ways. We were still spending a lot of time on testable skills inside of that unit. But kids were producing slam poetry and studying slam poetry and studying more traditional poetry. And she suggested that we use one of our school weekly community meetings to have a poetry slam competition. And at first I was like, that's a lot of work, and had all kinds of reasons why I didn't think that was a good idea. And happily she was like, believe me, it will be worth it. And so anyway, so we made that happen. It was toward the end of our unit. They still were turning in their very traditional stuff that we were asking from them, but they also knew we basically had a slam competition within our classrooms, and then several finalists got to perform for the whole school. And performing for your peers and other teachers at a school is kind of in the middle of what I think of a hierarchy of authentic audiences, right? An authentic audience out in the real world where you're actually working on behalf of a community or a particular client is even more authentic. But I do think it created a dramatic shift for us in how kids approached the work we were asking them to do. Even just the fact that they were going to have to perform in front of a broader range of peers in a higher stakes environment felt to that, it really changed the dynamic for us. It did not turn everything around, but it felt like a pretty high leverage way to start thinking about, the quality of our work matters, not because I say it matters and not because the rubric that I'm using to grade you matters, but because there are going to be people who are going to react to the messages you're trying to send or not if you don't send them effectively. And let's work toward that. And so that, I think, is one important step you can take, is just to think about, like, what would be the next step beyond, tacking a great essay to the wall of your classroom as a way to exhibit work and a way to sort of perform learning for others. So that's number one. And then number two, I would say, is around using all of the political capital you have, even if it's a small amount, to try to lobby to cover less and be able to go deeper. I think that all of the teachers we saw, both in and out of the periphery, who were producing really powerful learning for their students, we're doing it in a situation where they had the opportunity to go deep when it made sense, and we're not just racing through content, right? Like math teachers who, when a set of students have a puzzle or confusion around a particular problem or a particular dilemma, they had the sense to slow way down and really put that at the center of the work. And so, kids might not be on track with the pacing guide, but they spent all week thinking about what prime numbers really mean, for example, and had really interesting, complex discussions about that with examples generated from kids, right? So the idea that, in fact, slowing down makes opportunities to really go much deeper it's on the one hand feels fairly simple. On the other hand, I know too well that a lot of schools, there are so many reasons why teachers feel that they can't do that. And so I think wherever possible, finding opportunities to be able to slow down and go deeper and deviate from the kind of breakneck speed that some of us find we're being asked to move through things is really important and creates a lot of opportunities as well.
Yeah, those are really helpful, and they feel like doable launch steps. And then, of course, everyone will want to read the book and sort of decide for themselves exactly which parts, which of the inspiring examples and ideas they might be able to translate into their own course. I can't recommend the book enough. I loved it. I think everyone is going to love it. So I want to say thank you, Sarah, for coming on. And I want to ask, where can people go to connect with you?
That's a great question. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at Sarah M. Fine. That's where I do a lot of my professional connections. I love hearing from teachers. I try to follow as many teachers as I possibly can. I love hearing what's going on in their worlds and trying to connect them when they need it to people who can support them in their own endeavor to deepen what's happening in their classroom. And I'm really grateful, Betsy. I love having the chance to talk with you, and I'm delighted that you found the book to be so useful for your own thinking.
Thanks for hanging out with Sarah and me today. I hope you're excited to go check out the action guide in the show notes waiting for you at www.nowsparkcreativity.com. No matter when you're listening to this episode, you can find those show notes by clicking the podcast tab at the top of the page and then clicking on episode 86. I hope you'll share today's show and this book with a colleague, a friend, or an administrator who cares about deeper learning in schools. I know you care, and I know that you're an important part of creating positive, progressive change for the schools in our country. Keep spreading the word, my friend.